Dear student, I am Dr. Harel Thomas, Professor in Applied Geology, Dr. Harisingh Gour Vishwavidyalaya, Sagar. Today, I will deliver my lecture on time relation between deformation and metamorphism. I will cover this topic under the following heads: Introduction, Deformation and Metamorphism. Hope it will be useful for you. Try to be regular in course. Regionally metamorphosed rock are generally subjected to two or more deformation phases, each accompanied or followed by recrystallization of minerals through progressive metamorphic reaction. It is a matter of great significance to understand the link between the phases of deformation and recrystallization of minerals occurring as a result of mineral arrangement in the low energy sites during protected period of deformation. Metamorphism, that is orogenic, in a pure shearing regime, cystosity are parallel to the axial plane of folds that develop with the deformation at elevated temperature. At high temperature, continued deformation is controlled by the plasticity of the rock, during which the parallel to S3 direction and shortening parallel to S1 are accommodated by the shear plane that are located to 45° to the principal stress. So, in simple shear regime, where deformation is non-collinear or non-coaxial, both cystosity and cleavage are often formed and need to be numbered as S1, S2, etc. It is with respect to the prominent cystosity that tectonic significance of the porphyroblast, poikiloblast is understood. The study of these inclusions defining internal cystosity, abbreviated as SI, as against the external cystosity SE, defining the matrix, is very important in deciphering the time relation between growth of minerals and the deformation events. Porphyroblast can be syntectonic or synkinematics, pre-tectonic or pre-kinematics, or post-tectonic post-kinematics. With respect to the most common cystosity in the rock, the main cystosity is often superimposed by one or more deformation phases and can be recognized as transposed foliation, which may undergo further deformation and hence may be mechanically reoriented, and so microfolding, kinking, etc., or may even be formed anew with different or similar orientation as the previous cystosity. Syntectonic porphyroblasts have a growth simultaneously with the deformation of rocks. Such porphyroblasts show a spiral pattern of their inclusion or SI and is called snowball texture because the mineral during growth are rolled by shear along the cystosity. This interpretation has been a controversial topic over the years. Alternate interpretation is that the cystosity rolled into a new orientation without the crystal being rolled at all, but this is a research topic for later studies and left here without further comments. But it must be recommended or it must be remembered that a syntectonic crystal often has oriented SI as aligned inclusion fabric, but more often cores of syntectonic crystal are densely included where the rims are already devoid of inclusion. Syntectonic crystals show spiral inclusion fabric, and when the inclusions are straight, they SI sharply discordant with the external fabric SE. Often the SI in marginal part of the syntectonic porphyroblast passes out of the crystal into SE without a break, but if the deformation outlasted the growth of the porphyroblast, there will be discordance between SI and SE. Pre-tectonic porphyroblast, in this case, the internal fabric SI of the crystal is likely to be discordant with SE, and the foliation often wrapped around the porphyroblast because it behaved like a rigid body while the matrix was being deformed. Beside the angularity between SI and SE, the pre-tectonic porphyroblast has also cracks and pressure shadow and wrapping of foliation. Pressure shadow are area of coarsely crystallized material, generally quartz, that develop in region around the large crystal since the region is shielded from the maximum compressive shear during deformation as depicted in a sketch on the right hand side in figure. Pre-tectonic crystals are characterized by fracture and or Budina's pressure shadow as low strain areas where new minerals preferentially crystallize because of strain partitioning around rigid large crystal. C. Kinking due to subsequent deformation. D. Undulose extension due to distortion of the crystal lattice. Post-tectonic porphyroblast, its features will be as the crystal has overprinted an already existing S surface cystosity. Consequently, the inclusion trails SI are parallel to and continuous with the external cystosity SE. Foliation is seen to about against the late crystallized porphyroblast. Post-tectonic porphyroblast can also show heliocentric structure if the static blast overprints a strain slip cleavage existing prior to the mineral growth. In general, the grain size of metamorphic rocks trend to increase with increasing grade of metamorphism as seen in the progression from the grain cell to coarse but still fine grained slates to coarse grained schist and gneisses. Regionally metamorphosed rock, at least those that eventually get exposed at the earth surface, are metamorphosed during deformation events. Since deformation involves the application of differential stress, the texturals that develop in the metamorphic rocks reflects the mode of deformation, and foliation or slaty cleavage that develop during metamorphism reflect the deformational mode and are part of the deformational structures. The deformation involved in the formation of fold thrust mountain belts generally involves compressional stress. The result of the compressional stress acting on the rock that behave in a ductile manner. Ductile behavior is favored by high temperature, high confining stress, pressure and low strain rates. This the folding of rock, original bedding or folded into a series of anticlines and synclines with fold axis perpendicular to the direction of maximum compression stress. The fold can vary in their scale from centimeter to several kilometers between hinges. Note that since the axial plane are oriented perpendicular to the maximum compressional stress direction, slaty cleavage or foliation should also develop along this direction. Thus, slaty cleavage or foliation is often seen to be parallel to the axial planes of folds. This is sometimes referred to axial plane cleavage or foliation. Metamorphic differentiation, as discussed earlier, gneisses and to some extent schist show compressional banding or layering, usually evidenced as alternating somewhat discontinuous bands or layers of dark colored ferromagnesium minerals and light colored quartz feldspathic layers. The development of such compositional layering or banding is referred to as metamorphic differentiation. Throughout the history of metamorphic petrology, several mechanisms have been proposed to explain metamorphic differentiation. In some rocks, the compositional layering may not represent metamorphic differentiation at all, but instead could simply be the result of original bedding. For example, during the early stage of metamorphism and deformation of interbedded sandstone and shells, the compositional layering could be preserved even if the maximum compressional stress direction were at an angle to the original bedding. In such a case, a foliation might develop in the shell layers due to recrystallization of clay minerals or crystallization of other sheet silicate with a preferred orientation controlled by the maximum stress direction. Here, it would be easy to determine that the compositional layers represented original bedding because the foliation would cut across the compositional layering. In highly deformed rocks that have undergone with folding and shearing, it may be more difficult to determine that the compositional layering represents original bedding, as shearing stretch the bedding. Individual folded beds may be stretched out and broken that the original folds are not easily seen. Similarly, if the rock has been injected by dikes or sill prior to metamorphism, these contrasting compositional bends, not necessarily parallel to the original bedding, could be preserved in the metamorphic rocks. Second, transposition of the original bedding, original compositional layering. A rock could also become transposed into a new orientation during metamorphism. The diagram shown on screen how this could occur. In the initial stage, a new foliation begins to develop in the rock as a result of compressional stress at same angle to the original bedding. As the mineral that form this foliation grow, they begin to break up an original beds into the small pots. As the pots are compressed and extended partially by recrystallization, they could eventually intersect again to form new compositional bands parallel to the new foliation. Third, solution and re-precipitation. In fine-grained metamorphic rocks, small-scale folds called King's band often develop in the rock as the result of application of compositional stress. A new foliation begins to develop along the axial planes by the folds. Quartz and feldspar may dissolve as a result of pressure solution and be re-precipitated at the hinge of the fold, where the pressure is lower. As the new foliation begins to align itself perpendicular to S1, the end result would be alternating bands of mica or sheet silicates and quartz or feldspar with layering parallel to the new foliation. Preferential nucleation. Fluid present during metamorphism have the ability to dissolve minerals and transport ions from one place in the rock to another. Thus, the felsic minerals could be dissolved from one part of the rock and preferentially nucleated and grow in another part of the rock to produce discontinuous layer of alternating. Migmatization. As discussed previously, migmatites are small pots and lenses that occur in high-grade metamorphic terrain that may represent melts of the surrounding metamorphic rocks. Injection of these melt into pots and layers in rocks could also produce the discontinuous banding often seen in the high-grade metamorphic rocks. The process would be similar to that described in 4 above, except that it could involve partially melting the original rock to produce a felsic belt, which could then migrate and crystallize in pots and layers in the metamorphic rocks. Further, deformation of the rock could then stretch and fold such layers, but that they may no longer be recognized as migmatite. Some other textures. Caliphatic texture, a type of replacement texture. A caliphatic texture is a replacement of one mineral along its rim by another intergrowth of two or more mineral in a way that the new mineral almost completely surround the mineral being replaced. The term is most commonly used when replacing mineral formed during retrogression. For example, caliphatic rims of chloride plus iron oxide after garnet. Reaction rim texture. When one mineral replaces another along its rim, suggesting a reaction between both phases. The contact to both phases are irregular. Third, corona texture. Several centimeter layers of one or more minerals completely encircled the older phase. The layer, which range from 1 to 5 in numbers, the represent in sequence of reaction that have take place none to completion in replace of minerals in the core of center of the corona. Corona formed during the both prograde and retrograde metamorphism. Atoll texture, where the core of the mineral is dissolved or replaced, leaving behind the surviving rims. Such texture usually form due to an original compositional zoning within the mineral with the replaced core. Rotational texture, when the inclusions are oriented at an angle that suggesting the poikiloblast may have rotated during its growth, thus indicating syn-deformational or syn-tectonic growth. An alternative interpretation of such texture is the rotational of the foliation during the growth of poikiloblast, which still makes the growth syn-deformational. Sixth, snowball texture is similar to the rotational texture, but where the inclusion define a spiral tail that may have developed from the rotational over of the poikiloblast. Helicystic texture, where the poikiloblast overgrow the pre-existing foliation. This texture therefore indicates post-tectonic recrystallization of the poikiloblast. Mica fish, a lenticular porphyroblast of mica which commonly developed in a shear stress environment and can be used to indicate the sense of shear. X solution texture, resulting from incomplete miscibility between two components and members of a solid solution series. A decrease in temperature may result in the separation of these two phases, one in the other, commonly along cleavage planes, commonly in a high-grade rocks which cooled slowly. Dear student, today in this lecture we have discussed time relation between deformation and metamorphism, are very important part of metamorphic petrology. For further studies, please read the textbooks, references and links given in the text. Thank you very much.